All right, so today we're talking about how did World War I impact European colonial holdings? And I had said in class that this is really going to be like the focus of our World War I section of this unit when talking about world history. How was areas outside of Europe actually impacted by World War I? So the first country we're going to be looking at is India. And the first question is going to be, why did nationalism begin in India? So the group that is going to become kind of like the leader of Indian nationalism and moving towards Indian independence is a group called the Indian National Congress. So the Indian National Congress was founded in 1885. It was founded in the city of Bombay, which is today the city of Mumbai. Now, it says here that independence was the goal of the movement, but that's actually not how it started out. Now, the Indian National Congress, you could refer to it as the INC. You could also just refer to it as Congress. It makes it a little bit easier, especially when writing your notes. So it started out as study clubs centered in various different cities: Bombay, Pune, Calcutta, Madras. And it originally supported British rule. And it was used as a forum for opinions where Indians could kind of voice their opinions on British government in India, and then could then provide a place where discontent can kind of be worked out, forwarded to the British government to prevent any like bigger problems from happening. The major concerns of the people that founded the Indian National Congress were employment in the colonial bureaucracy. This was a group of very educated, middle to upper middle class Indians. They were businessmen, or, like I said, they held jobs in the colonial bureaucracy. They were very loyal to the British, and one of their major concerns was having fair access to employment and being able to rise up in the system. They were, like I said, very loyal to their British rulers and believed that if their grievances were known, that their grievances could be fixed. Now, like I said, a lot of the educated Indians were very concerned with racism amongst the British because the Indians working for the British received less salary than British, and they had very limited opportunities for advancement. Now, English becomes a unifying language for India during this time, because if you remember, we've mentioned in class before that India really was a series of separate kingdoms with separate histories and traditions and different languages. Excuse me. But English becomes the unifying language and allows them to realize that the conditions that they were facing in their part of India were same all across India. And people began to realize that they had a shared grievance, and they began to develop like a South Asian identity, which really wasn't there before. But if you could see, a lot of these men that joined it were businessmen, were the major backers of Congress. They were Western educated, dressed in Western style, but they were upset over the preference that was usually shown to British investors, and they felt that there was a drain of Indian resources flowing out of India, especially because a large portion of India's budget went directly to Britain, went to help fight the wars for the British and fund other things back in Britain. They also were annoyed that their taxes were paying for the salaries and the pensions of British administrators, even though there were qualified Indians, but they were not allowed to take those jobs. They also were upset. We talked about this in class. We did that reading on the railroads about how the railway equipment, the steel, and new manufactured goods were all bought from Britain and was really keeping the economy from progressing. And especially because the needs of the British economy drove the peasantry more towards cash crops like cotton and jute and indigo. And we see, and we've talked about this in class before, a decline in the food production, which led to a lot of famines pre-World War I, and the British really didn't do anything to ease the suffering. So this is where the nationalist movement is going to grow in India, and then started out as a movement that was still kind of pro-British rule, and then eventually it's going to be a movement that is going to fight for independence for India. But you can see this image of the Calcutta session of Congress from 1890. So the next question is, how did these conditions lead to a rise of militant nationalism in India? So some people felt that Congress, worked too much with the British, and there was more of a movement of wanting to really push India further. So the Hindus made up the majority of India, as we know. And so some people, like this man here, whose name was B.G. Tilak, Tilak, he believed that nationalism should be based on Hinduism. That should be the unifying factor. And so he wanted to restore the ancient traditions of Hinduism. And he used a lot of religious festivals to kind of hide actual political demonstrations. So you would have these large gatherings for like Holi or Diwali, which are Hindu holidays, and then use that as the cover and then actually try to kind of propose different political changes for India. And so they began to demand a boycott of British manufactured goods. And Tilak was leading a movement that wanted full independence for India and was willing to use violent rebellion in order to be able to obtain that. Now, he is the first nationalist leader to actually gain a mass following in India. However, he is exiled to Burma for 6 years. And during that time, his support kind of died down. It was kind of smart of the British, rather than arresting him or executing him, where he would have gained kind of notoriety, just kind of send him off to Burma, where he can kind of like fade into obscurity, which is in some ways what happened, because his support died down in that time. You also had groups of what were called Hindu communalists. And this was a small group, but they were advocating the use of terrorism. They felt that Congress was just too slow moving, their approach was just too gradual. This group was quasi-religious. They used Hinduism to try to support their cause or define their cause. But they also would train their followers how to use firearms and how to make bombs. And they targeted British officials and government buildings. However, they were always very small in number. They never gained large support, and they were able to be easily suppressed by the British. And a lot of the more moderate people in India, the Hindus and the Muslims both, were very kind of offended almost by this. They did not like this kind of more militant view. What winds up happening, though, is the Western educated lawyers wind up becoming kind of like the dominant force in pushing India towards nationalism. So that's going to take us to this question. Why did Gandhi emerge as the leader of the nationalist struggle? So Gandhi's probably our most famous of the Indian independence leaders, I should say. So Gandhi lived from 1869 to 1948, and we could see this is a picture of him as a young child. He actually was a he was a lawyer. He was trained in London. This is actually an image of him with the London Vegetarian Society in 1890 when he was in London. After he was in London and became trained as a lawyer, he actually went to South Africa, which was another British colony, to work as a barrister or a lawyer there. And it's really when he went to South Africa and he was kind of confronted with the very vicious racism that the British government had towards the Africans living in South Africa, and also towards the Indians living in South Africa, because there was a large Indian population in South Africa. Many of them were working as indentured servants, and they too were under certain race restrictions, because you had blacks, you had whites, and you had coloreds, and the Asians, the South Asians, fell into the coloreds category, and each group had different rights, different rules that they had to follow. So actually Gandhi got his start as a nationalist leader, kind of fighting against the injustices of British racial policy in South Africa. And he eventually actually gets kicked out of South Africa by the British. And that's why he comes back to India. So he comes back to India kind of right before World War I. Now, you can see this is Gandhi as a lawyer in Johannesburg in South Africa. But again, when we think of Gandhi, we kind of think of him more like this, dressed in this kind of traditional cotton cloth. So this is kind of becomes a form of protest in itself. Gandhi kind of is able to do what the Indian National Congress isn't able to do. The Indian National Congress, because they are Western educated and they dress like Westerners, and they speak English, they're seen as different than, the villagers and the common people in India. And they had a hard time gaining a mass following. Gandhi was able to do both. He had the Western education, he had the law background, so he could sit down and negotiate with the British and understand fully what he's talking about as far as the legal implications, but at the same time, because he presented himself in Indian homespun, meaning like cloth that he himself wove for himself, he was able to present himself as a man of the people, and the people loved him for that. So India plays a rather large role in World War One. India gave a lot of loans to Britain. There many soldiers fought in World War One. About close to 1 million Indian soldiers fought in World War One. They were sent to places like Africa and the Middle East. And people like Gandhi and even Tilak supported the British war effort, and they actually toured India trying to sell war bonds to help raise money for the war effort, because they were promised certain things. They were promised that if the Indians supported the war effort for the British, they would get self-government after the war was over. And we do start to see some of those movements towards a little bit more self-government, even prior to World War I. So in 1909, the Morley-Minto reforms were passed. And so Morley is spelled Morley, and Minto is Minto. So these reforms were passed in 1909, and it allowed educated Indians more opportunities to vote and serve on local and national councils in India. So after World War I, in 1919, we have the passage of the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, and I'll spell that for you. Montagu, and then Chelmsford, Chelmsfor. And what the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms did is it increased the power of the Indian legislatures. So it seems like the British were giving in to some of their promises that they had made, but however, they did not live up to all of their promises. So throughout the war, there was a great deal of inflation in India, which hurt large parts of the Indian population. The British government set price ceilings, meaning like they set prices for certain goods, like produce. And because of that, people had a hard time making money because they weren't being able to sell their goods for market value. A lot of people were very disgruntled with the British and how they felt like their promises weren't met. So they began to speak out against British rule. And the British responded also in 1919 with something called the Rowlatt Act, Rowlatt. And this act put restrictions on civil rights and freedom of the press. So people, for instance, they were not allowed to meet in large crowds. They weren't allowed to publish newspapers that were speaking out against the British. And they really tried, there was a curfew placed upon the people. So they were really trying to kind of tamp down the nationalist movement that was beginning to grow. So that's why Gandhi began to kind of gain more support for a movement towards independence. Gandhi preferred to use nonviolent protest tactics like boycotts and strikes. He believed in what we call non-cooperation, and he loved to have these mass demonstrations that were peaceful, but were showing to the world that they were not going to follow British law. And if you think of the tactics that Dr. Martin Luther King took in our own country during the Civil Rights Movement, Dr. King did actually borrow very heavily from Gandhi. So that's why a lot of the whole nonviolent, non-cooperation, civil disobedience might sound familiar to you from 8th grade in learning about the civil rights movement in our own country. Gandhi referred to these demonstrations, he called them satyagraha, which meant truth force. And I'll spell that for you too. Satyagraha. So satyagraha, which means truth force. And it was very difficult for the British to kind of stand up to this because they were acting non-violently. And when the British sometimes did respond with violent methods, it really did vilify the British to the world. But at this point, after World War I, so what we start to see in India is a movement towards Indian nationalism and independence. But we're not actually going to see independence really come true in India until after World War II. So we're going to leave India for now and switch to another country. And like I said, we'll come back to India later when we talk about the aftermath of World War II. So the next question we're going to focus on, next area of the world we're going to look at is the Middle East. So why did Middle Eastern nationalism begin in Egypt? So we know already that there was a great deal of interest in Egypt on the part of the British because of the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal made Egypt a really important place for Britain because that canal created a huge shortcut to India. And especially during World War I, that was really important because India was getting a lot of its supplies Britain was getting a lot of its supplies from India during World War I. So they didn't want anything to kind of jeopardize their access to that canal, which is why there's actually going to be a theater of the war fought in Egypt in both World War I and World War II because of the Suez Canal. But despite that, Egyptian nationalism began in the late 19th century because in the late 19th century, Egypt was still part of the Ottoman Empire. And British actually coming into Egypt comes a little bit later. So originally, the Egyptians were gaining greater autonomy from the Ottomans and then kind of almost functioning as an independent state, even though technically they were still part of the Ottoman Empire. But then eventually, the British kind of swoop in and create a protectorate in Egypt. So the British government in India was dominated by a man named Lord Cromer, Cromer, and he was the High Commissioner of Egypt. And so he made a lot of reforms in the bureaucracy, and he built a lot of public works projects, mainly focused around the production of cotton, because Egyptian cotton was something that was considered highly valuable, a very profitable and very luxurious product. Like Egyptian cotton goes for a lot more money than regular cotton. However, cotton is really, really hard on the soil, so that created problems. But infrastructure was built to kind of create canals and irrigation ditches to kind of like water these areas with this very intensive kind of crop being grown. Bottom line, though, only a very tiny middle class and the upper like aristocracy, like large landowners, really were benefiting from British rule. For the masses, British rule was very exploitative because the British in Egypt relied on what was called the Ayans, Ayan. The Ayans were your large landowners. And so the large landowners, the Ayans, kind of helped the British to rule Egypt for them. And they were the ones that were getting most of the benefit from the irrigation, from the railways, because that all enabled these large landowners to grow massive amounts of cotton and then export it to Britain for a profit. And because there was no legal restrictions placed on the Ayans, we see a lot of the smaller landowners kind of being swallowed up by these large estates, and a lot of them were becoming landless tenants. Meanwhile, the Ayans were living back in the cities in Egypt, kind of living a very luxurious life, and then having their estates managed by hired managers. So the Egyptian independence movement is going to be led by the small middle class that you have in Egypt, and they were known as the Effendi, Effendi. And the Effendi, like again, were your sons of your business and professional families, like this newly growing but still very, very small middle class that we have in in Egypt. So the Effendi in the 1890s and early 1900s began running newspapers, exposing British corruption and kind of exposing the Egyptian government that was pretty much allowing the British to kind of control Egypt. They attacked the British for racism. They attacked the British for having all of the well-paying positions in the government, similar to what we see happening in India. However, there was no Egyptian equivalent of the INC, or the Indian National Congress. There were a lot of different rival political parties kind of fighting for independence. And there was no one that managed to speak for the majority of the Indian people like a Gandhi. You didn't have that equivalent in Egypt. Now, 1906, though, even though they're talking prior to World War I, in 1906, this is going to change because there's something known as the Din Shawai incident occurs. And that's spelled DINSHAWAI. Now, the Egyptian villagers lived a very poor, simple life. So they actually would raise pigeons to supplement their diet. Now, you think about when we think of pigeons, we kind of think of them as dirty. Also, they're not very big, so you're not getting very much meat from it. But these people were very poor and they were desperate, so they would eat pigeon. And the British used to think it was great fun to hunt pigeons. And to them, it was like a pastime. So these poor villagers, barely making enough to survive, barely having enough food to eat, raising pigeons out of desperation to eat. And the British think it's fun to hunt the pigeons. So one day, the British officers were hunting pigeons outside the village of Dinshawai, and accidentally shot a wife of a prayer leader who was outside of her home, like a stray bullet, and she was shot and killed. As a result, there was angry villagers that mobbed the officers, and they got nervous and they actually shot at some of the villagers. This led to like a full-scale riot where there were some British officers that were killed and there were some villagers that were killed. And in this picture, you could see this is the scaffold that's being built to hang four of the villagers. And then then others were publicly beaten. Some of the villagers were sent to, hard labor. Meanwhile, nothing was done to the British officers. So the reaction sparked protest in the press and the nationalist parties, and this really helped to kind of like unite Egypt in trying to fight against British rule. And even the Ions began to, at this point, support the nationalist cause. So in 1913, right before World War I begins, Britain grants Egypt a constitution and gives them representation in parliament. And so here you could see this is some of the fighting, the things that would work, the protests. So the next question is, why did a revolt break out in Egypt? So during World War I, like I said, Egypt became an important center of the war because of the Suez Canal and the importance of the Suez Canal. So as a result, martial law was enforced in Egypt. Martial law means military law. So you pretty much lose all your civil liberties. So the type of self-government they literally just got a year before the war started ends because of World War I. So they're under military law because the British troops are stationed there to protect the Suez Canal. Because the Ottomans, who are fighting on the side of the Germans and the Austrians, are trying to make this into a holy war. So they're telling the Egyptians, who've had a history of being kind of independent from the Ottomans, that they need to stand with the Ottoman Empire as fellow Muslims and kind of fight against this Christian advance. And so the Turks tried to kind of bring the Egyptians back, and at the same time you have the Egyptians that are dealing with this very heavy British troop presence in Egypt. Now, large numbers of troops were stationed in Egypt, which was a huge drain on the food supplies in Egypt. A lot of people were conscripted into forced labor. A lot of people had their draft animals confiscated. As a result, there was a great deal of inflation and food shortages, and a famine broke out amongst the Egyptian people, having this burden of the British soldiers stationed in Egypt. After the war, the educated nationalists demanded a hearing at Versailles. Because if you remember from our discussion in class on Wilson and the 14 points, Wilson said that the colonized people should have self-determination. They should be able to decide what type of government their country is going to have. So when they heard that, a group was created in Egypt saying, well, we should be allowed to go and sit at the negotiating table and get that self-determination that Wilson promised in the 14 points. But the British denied the Egyptian leaders permission to go to France. And this led to mass demonstrations and student-led riots and insurrections all over Egypt. And the revolts were put down with the use of force. But it became clear to the British that they needed to begin to negotiate a withdrawal from Egypt. So that's why in 1922, we begin to see a staged withdrawal from Egypt. However, the old regime was preserved that had been in place when the British were ruling Egypt. That kind of goes back to the Ottoman Empire. And the British reserved the right to reoccupy Egypt if it's threatened, which is going to happen in World War II, and Egypt is going to be reoccupied during World War II. So this new government that was put in place of Egyptians was, like I said before, because it was like representative of the Ions, they did very little to help the people. And for many of the political leaders, political office was a way for them to increase their powers. So that's why in 1952, this man, Gamal Abdul Nasser, he leads a military coup. He is from what's called the WAFD Party, WAF apostrophe D. Because at this time, when Nasser um, leads his revolt against the government, about only 70% of Egypt's arable land was owned by only 6% of the Egyptian population. So that broke down to basically like 12,000 families controlled like 37% of the land. 98% of the people were illiterate. Malnutrition was very common. So that's why he's going to rise up and take power in Egypt in 1952. Now, that's going to start a strain of basically military style rule in Egypt that's going to last pretty much all the way up till today. Because a couple of years ago, when we had the Arab Spring and the Egyptian people fought to overthrow their leader, what we wound up having is you did have a very short-lived democracy in Egypt where people elected a civilian leader, but then the military staged another coup and kind of took back over the government in Egypt. So it's still very much a fluid situation in Egypt right now. Right now. So moving out of Egypt, but still staying in the Middle East. Why did nationalism spread to other parts of the Middle East? So, when we look at the current Israeli-Palestinian conflict in Israel that we still see now going on to this day, the roots of it really is started with the end of World War I, and even a little bit before World War I. But the end of World War I brought an end to the Ottoman Empire. So as a result, lands were occupied by the French and the British after the war, which also upset many people in the area because the Arab people that lived in the Middle East, who were part of the Ottoman Empire, were promised that if they fought on the side of the British and the French, they would get an Arab state. They would get their own country at the end. And instead, what we see is the Middle East is basically divided up between France and Britain. So it's carved into what we call mandates. So Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon were under the control of the League of Nations. And a lot of people saw this as a betrayal, and they felt humiliated, and they were angered. And we start to see a lot of nationalist groups begin to gain popularity throughout the region. Now, what also happens, if we look at this map here, is the British received what was referred to as Palestine from the League as a League of Nations mandate in 1922. And it's a couple of things that happen in regard to this. So in the late 19th century, there was a great deal of increased persecution to the Jewish populations in Israel, in Europe. Remember, we talked about the pogroms in Russia and the discrimination that the Jewish faced in Russia. But that wasn't just Russia. It was pretty widespread all across Europe. There was this uptick in persecution. And as a result, many Jewish people in Europe felt that they would never be able to assimilate into European culture. They're never going to be safe, and they need their own nation. The only way the Jewish people, the opinion became, was if there was for them to be, safe from the rest of the world, was if they had their own nation where they could protect themselves. So the problem with this receiving of this British mandate by the British after World War I is that during the war, the British made promises to the Jews and the British made promises to the Arabs, basically promising them the same pieces of land. Because if we go back to this previous picture, this man here, his name is Theodor Herzl, Herzl. And he was an Austrian journalist. And he was covering a huge sensationalized trial in France that was known as the Dreyfus Affair. Dreyfus was an officer in the French army who was accused of treason, and he was convicted. It was later found that the documents that were used to convict him or to implicate him were actually forged. So he gets a new trial, but he's still found guilty. I think he has to have like a second trial, a third trial, in order to actually get his innocence that he had all along. This trial was like the trial of the century in France. It like ripped the French people apart. You had people that supported Dreyfus, you had people who were against Dreyfus, you had people chanting death to Jews in the street. And Herzl, who was a journalist, was covering this. And he's looking at this all and he's saying to himself, we as Jews are never going to be safe in Europe unless we have our own country. So in 1897, he forms the World Zionist, Zionist organization. And in 1917, Lord Balfour, who was a British official, promises the Zionist organization in 1917 that they would be given a Jewish homeland. And as a result, many Jewish people began to migrate into the area, into what today we call Israel. And so Balfour's promises and the British takeover of Palestine was seen as a double betrayal to the Arab people. And this created Arab opposition that led to the British having to take back many of the promises that were made to the Jews because there was so much turmoil going on. As a result of this, the Arabs really began to distrust the British, and the Jews were distrusting the British. And this led the Jewish groups to build up their own resistance, their own defenses against the Arabs. And there was no strong leadership in Palestine to oppose the Jews who were moving into the area in large numbers, who did have an organized group put into place. And this so really becomes the roots of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which, again, we're going to revisit later because Israel does not become a nation till, again, after World War II. So the next question, the last question, is why did independence movements begin in Africa? So now we already know that many African soldiers were also used, pretty much against their will, to become soldiers in the British, French, German armies. And just like we see in India, and just like we see in Egypt, it's many of the Western educated Africans started out being loyal to their colonizers during World War I. However, a lot of rebellions broke out because of the forcible recruitment of the soldiers and the laborers. And this led to like all sorts of upheaval. In addition, there was a decline in demand for cash crops because of the war. So the economies of these countries went down. Crops were being used to feed the soldiers, so people didn't have enough food. Promises were given again, just like in India, that if you help us out during World War I, we'll give you better treatment, we'll give you better jobs, and the war is over. And those promises were not kept. So after the war, people were starting to get angry. So in the 1920s, we start to see attempts to build what we call Pan-African organizations, or organizations that are encompassing all the African people, not just within the continent of Africa, but also the diaspora, people who are taken out of Africa as slaves. So the leadership of this Pan-African movement was African American and was also West Indian. But those challenges that those people faced, the people faced living in the Americas, had much different challenges than the people living on the continent of Africa itself. So it made the movement very difficult to really try to kind of come together. However, there were a series of conferences held in the 1920s and 1930s that were very well attended and started to create a support for the independence movements across the African nations. We also start to see a movement called the Negritude movement, Negritude, which was a literary movement that wanted to try to combat the racial stereotyping that's saying that African people had no culture, African people had no art. It really tried to combat that. So we also start to see in Britain, the British colonies, that the Western educated Africans were, after World War I, given opportunities to build political organizations. So we see organizations formed like the National Congress of British West Africa. And they began to gain some representation in colonial legislatures. And we start to see newspapers being published, trying to gains public support for more independence for the African nations. So again, what we see is a beginning of a movement towards nationalism and independence. However, most of these for the African continent do not come to fruition until the 50s, the 60s. The last African nation gaining their independence is in 1973. But we're definitely seeing the foundations for those movements beginning to be formed. So the question I want to leave you with, I want you to think about, why did the colonial holdings of Europe begin to move towards independence?